In World War I, like in most wars, fortune favors the brave, but it favors more the person with the most resources. And in World War I, what we're going to see is total mobilization of economies and populations, of science, and of whole cultures against one another. The war is remarkably brutalizing. It becomes iconic in European history. It changes philosophies. It changes power structures. And in the end, it ushers in a 20th century that will be fairly different from anything we've seen before in the 19th. In many ways, World War I is a war of technologies. Lots of new technology enter the war. We talked about Krupp manufacturing in the chapter on industrial. Well, Krupp's day comes into its own. Heavy artillery is the #1 killer in World War I. Artillery is a constant element of the war. Lots of promises of its capacities made. It doesn't deliver on all of them, but as a killing machine, it's unrivaled in the war. Machine guns, again, iconic images of the war, make those Napoleonic massed attacks suicidal for armies nowadays. By World War I, we now have a war that will kill more of its combatants actually in action than simply in camp. And machine guns are part of that. Infantries that march into reinforced trench-like positions are going to get cut down. Tanks promise to be the answer to this stalemate in the trenches. They're introduced relatively late, 1916, and even then they're a little buggy, they're not perfectly worked out. Tanks will be our icon for the Second World War in Europe, not the First World War. They're there, they just don't play as big a part as they might have. Submarines, probably one of the most novel of the technological contributions to the war. Submarine warfare is part of that engaging of the entire culture, of the entire population. The Germans are best for their submarines, their U-boats. And they use them to offset British surface battle fleet superiority. The Germans attempt to blockade the British home islands, attempt to cut off the empires and the resources of their enemies, the French and the British, by sinking incoming cargo ships. And the submarines attempt to do that, and they are remarkably successful. Not wholly so, but enough so that every other military is going to copy the German U-boat after the war. U-boats, submarines, again, will show up in World War II in a big way. It's just everybody's going to have them, even though most people were griping about how unfair they were in the First War. Airplanes are introduced, primarily, and Snoopy and the Red Baron aside, dogfights are not the primary use for airplanes. They are also not heavy enough to be major weapons to carry strategic or tactical style bombing. Instead, airplanes are primarily reconnaissance vehicles. The camera and the airplane become invaluable weapons of all armies as they try to observe their opponent's positions and work out strategies for determining exposed positions, where best to exploit a weakness, things like that. Finally, that whole chemicals industry that we saw and talked about in the Industrial Revolution comes into play. It comes into play in medicines, it comes into play in foodstuffs and preservatives and things like that. Again, most notably, and the picture that I used here for the first one, gas warfare, chemical weaponry becomes a part of the First World War. It is a dangerous weapon to use even for those people who employ it. A weapon that is at the whim of the wind can turn against you as well. Chemical weapons require chemical responses, and so gas warfare produces gas masks. And it's so horrific that it has provided a real cautionary tale to armies ever since, and it's considered one of the real out-of-bounds elements for militaries even today. Other resources, though, and especially financial. This is particularly the case with the United States' role before they become combatants. Both sides, the Entente and the Alliance powers, are trying to engage the Americans. The Alliance mostly to keep them out, the Entente to encourage financial support. Wars are expensive. Win or lose, they're going to cost you a lot of money. Britain had been the financial hub of Europe at the end of the 19th century. That mantle is going to pass to the Americans. The Americans loan lots and lots of money. While they are still technically neutral, their money is decidedly unneutral, helping British and French armies in the field. The empires themselves are working very hard to mobilize the resources that they have in their empire. The British bring in troops from all over the globe: Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, Chinese. The French are going to bring in North Africans. Both armies are going to work in the Middle East to try to topple the Ottoman Empire and to make new friends there. So material resources, human resources, the power of empire employed to try to tip the balance in what is essentially a European struggle. Finally, what we will see is a lot of the political collapse of the old order as well. Like I said, the balance of power has fallen apart. The Congress of Vienna system has fallen apart. One of the things that helped to rush this into play were some of those ideologies that grew up during the 19th century, especially nationalism. But the idea of democratic governments, the idea of self-determination, national rule, anti-imperialistic forces. World War I is going to see the collapse of 4 of the major empires. The Russian Empire is going to come apart as the Tsar abdicates, and revolution will lead to a communistic government coming out and a civil war for the Russians. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire that had already split in the 1860s to give autonomy to the Hungarians, is going to simply fragment. It's going to shatter. Lots of different nationalistic groups, the Hungarians, but also Slavs and Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, the Greeks. Others are going to call for national determination, and in the end, all that will be left of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at least the Austrian part, will be a small country of Austria that's determined at the peace table. The Ottoman Empire similarly shatters. The remnant will be the nation of Turkey that exists after the war, but all of that Ottoman territory of the Middle East and North Africa is parted out between the victors, Britain and France in particular, but the United States gets a little chunk also, but all in a move towards autonomy, towards self-rule. And finally, the German Empire collapses. The Kaiser abdicates, territory is taken away from Germany in Europe. The centrality of a powerful Germany is still acknowledged, and part of the problem that comes out of the peace is what do you do with Germany after the war. But Germany as a global empire is finished. This brings us to the peace treaty. The peace at the end of the war, when the shooting stopped at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, November 11th, 1918, the governments got together without real clear terms for victory. It had been a total war, and it had been pitched that way amongst all the populations. And so the peace needed to be, to make home populations happy, a total peace. And what this often meant, and what the Treaty of Versailles results in, is a vengeful peace. What the diplomats at Versailles, minus the Russians, minus the Germans, decide is that the Germans were responsible. And so the treaty contains a war guilt clause, holding Germany primarily responsible for this, and then burdening Germany with a big reparations cost. As we look at this period between World Wars I and World War II, the Treaty of Versailles is going to be one of those marker points that we keep having to go back to, its failures and its successes. One of its biggest promises was the League of Nations, an idea that was at least popularized and really supported by American President Woodrow Wilson, was the idea of a collective security body that would help prevent this kind of a disaster from happening again. The whole point is that if men of goodwill could sit down together, they could avoid problems like this. The League of Nations will be included in the Treaty of Versailles, but some really important players won't be. Probably the most important is the United States, who, having given birth to the idea, decide to abandon it later on and not participate. Like the treaty itself, the League of Nations will have a mixed result in the interwar period, and ultimately will fail to hold the peace that it was designed for in the beginning.